Beneath the indifferent gaze of the waxing moon, a single snowflake traced its fragile path to the earth, as if whispering secrets the stones refused to hear. Vesa Lunakind stepped into the trial circle at the first blush of dawn, her bare feet sinking into the frost-kissed gravel that bit like forgotten promises. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and impending judgment, the wind a low moan through the encircling pines that stood like silent sentinels on the mountain's edge. She was 20 years old, an omega whose life had unraveled like a thread pulled from the royal tapestry, leaving her exposed and alone. The accusations clung to her like the chill, traitor, whisperer of forbidden truths, bearer of a curse that had poisoned the pack's sacred bonds. She could not refute them, for the evidence was woven into her very blood. The shattered moon pendant that dangled from her neck, its silver crescent fractured by the same hand that had sworn to protect her. The circle was ancient, its standing stones etched with runes that glowed faintly under the paling stars, symbols of the goddess's unyielding law. They formed a perfect ring, cold and unyielding, mirroring the faces of the gathered pack. Elders in fur-lined cloaks stood shoulder to shoulder with warriors whose breaths fogged the air, their eyes hard as the ice-glazed peaks beyond. No one spoke. The silence was a weapon sharper than any blade, pressing against Vesa's chest until her heart thundered in protest. She clutched the pendant tighter, its jagged edges drawing a thin line of blood that welled warm against her chilled skin. This was her exile, not in some distant wilderness, but here in the heart of the realm she had once called home. Banished not by decree, but by the weight of a verdict already carved in the snow-dusted earth. The high priestess, her face a mask of weathered ivory, raised her staff, its tip crowned with a crystal that caught the first rays of sun like a captive star. "Vesa Lunakind," she intoned, her voice carrying the cadence of ritual and finality. "You stand accused of unraveling the threads of loyalty, of invoking shadows that devour the light of our king and kin. The goddess demands balance. The pack demands blood." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of sympathy, but of grim acceptance. Vesa's knees trembled, but she held her gaze steady on the center stone, where flames from a low brazier licked at the dawn's edge, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters of what might have been. She had been marked for this from the moment the whispers began. An omega of no great lineage, she had served in the shadowed halls of the Frostspire Citadel, tending the hearths and the secrets that warmed them. But secrets have teeth, and hers had bitten deep. The pendant, a gift from her mother before the fever claimed her, had always hummed with an otherworldly warmth, a fragment of lunar essence said to guide the lost. Now it felt like a noose, its break a omen of her fall. The pack believed she had used it to spy, to sow discord among the alphas, leading to the fractures that weakened their borders against rival clans. Lies, perhaps, but truths enough to condemn her. Her rejection was complete. No mate claimed her, no kin rose in defense. She was adrift, a leaf in the winter gale, waiting for the storm to claim her. As the priestess began the execution chant, the words rose like smoke from the brazier, weaving through the air in a hypnotic rhythm. "By earth and frost, by blood and bone, we sever the thread, we call you home." The crowd joined, their voices a swelling tide, deep and resonant, vibrating through Vesa's bones. She felt the pull of it, the ancient magic tugging at her soul, urging surrender. The stones seemed to lean inward, the wind picking up to howl through the pines, carrying distant weavos that echoed like the cries of the forsaken. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, the cold seeping into her marrow, but she would not beg. What was strength, if not facing the abyss with eyes wide open? In that moment, as the chant crested toward its irrevocable peak, Vesa's lips parted. The forbidden name escaped her, soft yet piercing, cutting through the ritual like a blade through silk. Elendor. The massacre's ghost, buried by royal decree, the slaughter of innocents at the border 5 winters past, shrouded in the king's silence. Gasps rippled outward, the chant faltering like a fire starved of air. The name hung in the frigid dawn, a challenge to the veil of forgetfulness that had preserved the throne. From the raised dais beyond the stones, Alpha King Severin Kale rose. At 43, he was a figure carved from the mountains themselves, broad-shouldered, his silver-streaked hair bound back, his eyes the deep blue of glacial depths. Clad in armor of etched steel and fur, he bore the weight of his crown like a yoke, his face etched with lines of a guilt that no decree could erase. The massacre had been his shadow, a command issued in the heat of war, now festering like an untreated wound. He had seen the reports, buried them under layers of necessity and survival, but the name, Elendor, struck like a claw to the chest. His hand shot up, authority cracking the air like thunder. "Halt!" he commanded, his voice a low growl that silenced the wind itself. The priestess lowered her staff, the crowd shifting uneasily, their breaths held in collective suspense. Snow began to fall then, soft and relentless, blanketing the circle in a hush of white, each flake a confession from the sky. Severin's gaze locked on Vesa, piercing through the flurry, seeing not just the accused, but the mirror to his own fractured soul. The pendant at her throat caught a glint of moonlight lingering in the clouds, its shards reflecting his haunted reflection. In that suspended breath, the trial shifted. Justice, long bent to the king's will, now demanded its due. Could confession forge a path through the lies, or would the snow bury them both anew? Vesa stood unmoving, the blood from her palm staining the earth, wondering if the goddess had answered her defiance with mercy, or with a deeper trial yet to unfold. The king's eyes held a storm of their own, guilt warring with the iron of his rule, as the first flakes melted on her skin like tears too long withheld. The snow fell thicker now, veiling the trial circle in a shroud of white that muffled the pack's uneasy murmurs, turning the ancient stones into ghosts of themselves. Vesa's breath came in shallow bursts, the cold air searing her lungs as she stood frozen in the center, the pendant's edges still warm with her blood. The name she had uttered, Elendor, lingered like smoke, curling around the flames of the brazier, which sputtered as if choked by the truth it could no longer consume. She had expected death's swift embrace, not this fractured pause, where the goddess's judgment twisted into something sharper, more personal. Alpha King Severin Kale descended the dais with deliberate steps, his boots crunching through the fresh layer of snow that dusted the gravel like ash from a dying fire. The crowd parted without a word, their eyes darting between him and the Omega who had dared invoke the forbidden. He was no longer the distant sovereign of Frostspire Citadel, enthroned in furs and steel. Up close, the lines of his face spoke of sleepless nights, of burdens heavier than the crown of antlered bone he wore. At 43, his body bore the scars of battles long won, but his eyes, those glacial blues, held the fracture of a man haunted by commands he could not ungive. The massacre at Elendor had been his decree, a ruthless cull to stem the rival clan's advance, innocents caught in the fray like leaves in a blizzard. He had buried it under edicts of necessity, but guilt festered, a shadow that twisted his dreams into weavos of the slain. He stopped mere paces from her, close enough that Vesa could smell the faint tang of pine resin on his cloak, mingled with the metallic bite of his armor. The wind tugged at the edges of her tattered shift, exposing the pale skin of her arms to the bite of frost, but she did not flinch. Instinct stirred within her then, unbidden and primal, an Omega's pull toward the Alpha whose presence filled the circle like the moon's tide. It was not desire, not yet, but a recognition deep in her bones, as if the shattered pendant at her throat hummed in quiet harmony with the pulse she sensed beneath his stoic facade. Fear coiled in her gut, sharp as the gravel underfoot. This was the king who had let her kind fade into obscurity, who had signed the scrolls that isolated Omegas like her from the pack's heart. Curiosity flickered amid the dread. What madness had prompted her to speak the name? And why did his gaze, piercing through the swirling flakes, feel like a hand extended in the dark? Severin tilted his head, studying her as one might a blade drawn unexpectedly in counsel. "You invoke ghosts, girl," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind, carrying the weight of authority laced with something rawer. Regret, perhaps, or the echo of his own unspoken confession. "Elendor is a wound closed by decree. Why unearth it now, when the chant calls for your end?" Vessa's lips parted, but words caught like thorns in her throat. The snow melted on her lashes, blurring his form into a silhouette of shadowed power. Yet she felt the instinctive bond tug again, a warmth against the encroaching cold that she shoved down with all her will. He was the architect of her exile, the king whose wars had orphaned her mother, leaving only the pendant as legacy. To yield to this pull would be surrender, a betrayal of the isolation she had armored herself with. "Because the goddess does not forget," she whispered finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "And neither should her king. The blood at Elendor stains more than borders. It poisons the pack from within." A murmur swelled anew from the edges of the circle. The elders, shifting like wolves, scenting weakness. Severin's jaw tightened, the guilt in his eyes flashing like lightning over ice before he masked it. He had fled this truth for years, burying it in the endless duties of rule, cursing himself in the silence of his chambers where the fire's glow mocked his solitude. Yet here, in the raw light of dawn, this Omega's defiance stirred something he had long denied, a curiosity born of isolation, a fear that her words might unravel the fragile order he clung to. The pendant caught his eye then, its fractured crescent glinting with a faint, otherworldly silver, as if it held the moon's own judgment. He reached out, almost involuntarily, his gauntleted fingers brushing the chain at her neck. The contact was brief, electric, a spark that raced through Vessa's veins, igniting an instinctive trust she recoiled from, her body tensing as if burned. "Do not touch what you cannot claim," she hissed, stepping back, the snow swallowing the print of her foot. Fear and that denied pull warred within her, her heart pounding like distant thunder. Who was this king to halt her fate? Only to probe it like a wound? And why did his presence feel like the first true warmth in a life of frost? Severin's hand fell, the moment fracturing like the pendant itself. He straightened, the mask of the Alpha King slipping back into place, but the crack remained. "The trial is not ended," he declared to the gathering, his voice booming over the wind's howl. "Take her to the Undercroft. I will hear her truths myself." Warriors moved forward, their chains clinking softly in the hush, but as they seized Vessa's arms, her gaze locked with his one last time. In that exchange, amid the falling snow and the weavos carried on the breeze, a connection forged, instinctive, unwanted, born of shared shadows. She was led away, the cold stones of the path biting into her soles, wondering if this reckoning would free her or bind her deeper into the king's haunted realm. The Undercroft awaited, a cavern of ice-veined rock beneath the citadel, where torches flickered like hesitant confessions. As the iron door groaned shut behind her, Vessa pressed against the damp wall, the pendant's weight a reminder of destinies entwined. Above, Severin turned to the dispersing pack, the snow cloaking his steps, but the name Elendor echoed in his mind, a curse he could no longer outrun. What strength was there in denial when mercy whispered from the lips of the condemned? And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. The Undercroft's chill seeped into Vessa's bones like a lover's betrayal. the air thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten echoes. Iron-barred walls curved into shadow, lit only by the sporadic flicker of torches that cast elongated specters across the floor, their flames hissing as if protesting the confinement. She huddled against the rough-hewn wall, the chains at her wrists clinking softly with each shallow breath, a reminder of the fragile line between prisoner and pawn. The pendant lay heavy against her chest, its fractured silver now dulled by the dim light, yet it pulsed faintly, a rhythmic warmth that mocked the frost gnawing at her skin. Above, the citadel thrummed with the pack's subdued unrest, but down here, isolation wrapped around her like a shroud, amplifying the distant drip of water and the low growl of wind through unseen fissures. Hours blurred into a haze of waiting, her mind replaying the king's touch, the unintended brush of his gauntlet that had sent a forbidden spark through her veins. It was no mere accident. The instinctive pull of Omega to Alpha stirred unbidden, a tide she fought with every ounce of her will. He was Severin Kyle, the architect of silences that had orphaned her world, his decree at Elendor a blade that severed more than lives. To feel anything but defiance toward him was weakness, a surrender to the very hierarchies that had cast her aside. Yet curiosity gnawed at her edges, sharp as the chain's bite. Why halt the ritual? Why claim her truths when the pack's verdict hungered for blood? The iron door groaned open at last, admitting a gust of colder air laced with the metallic tang of snow. Severin entered alone, his silhouette filling the threshold like a storm cloud, the torchlight gilding the edges of his armor in fleeting gold. He carried no entourage, no guards to enforce his will. This was a reckoning stripped bare, his broad frame moving with a deliberate grace that belied the tension in his shoulders. At 43, he seemed both eternal and eroded, the silver threads in his hair catching the fire's glow like veins of moonlight on ice. His eyes, those glacial blues, swept the chamber before settling on her, piercing without mercy, yet laced with a melancholy that mirrored her own fractured resolve. "You speak of poison," he said, his voice a low timbre that resonated off the stones, echoing the weavos that haunted the peaks outside. He did not approach immediately, instead leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed as if to anchor himself against the pull he too must feel, the primal recognition that hung between them, unspoken and electric. Elendor was war's necessity, a cut to save the body. But you wield it like a mirror, forcing me to see the rot I buried. Vessa lifted her chin, the chains rattling as she shifted, her bare arms prickling with gooseflesh under his gaze. The wind's howl filtered through the cracks, carrying the faint scent of pine and impending storm, a reminder that the world above churned with threats unseen. "Necessity?" she echoed, her tone laced with the bitterness of one who had tasted exile's dregs. "Innocents died under your banner, their blood feeding the snow while you etched decrees to silence their ghosts. I am no spy, no curse-bearer. The pendant. It only reveals what the goddess wills, and she wills truth, even if it unravels your throne." He pushed off the wall then, closing the distance in measured steps, the clink of his boots on stone syncing with her quickening pulse. Up close, the lines of guilt etched deeper into his face, a map of nights spent wrestling shadows in the citadel's high chambers. Severin had ruled with an ethical iron, his melancholy a private forge where duty tempered regret, but Elendor lingered like a curse, twisting his commands into self-doubt. This Omega, with her defiant whisper and shattered heirloom, stirred a curiosity he could not dismiss, a fear that her words might expose not just his past, but the fragility of his reign. Rivals circled the borders, whispers of betrayal from within the pack growing bolder under the waxing moon. To confront her was to invite vulnerability, yet ignoring her felt like inviting collapse. As he knelt to her level, eye to eye, the air thickened with shared breath, the torch flames leaping as if sensing the tension. Truth is a blade with two edges, he murmured, his voice softening to a rumble that vibrated through her chest. It cuts the wielder as deeply. Tell me of the pendant. Why does it hum with light no forge could mimic? His hand hovered near her throat, not touching, but the proximity ignited that instinctive bond anew, a warmth blooming in her core, empathy flickering amid the fear. She saw it then, in the subtle softening of his jaw. Not the king, but the man marked by loss, his wife's death years prior, leaving him adrift in duty's cold embrace. Vesa hesitated, the rational part of her screaming to resist, to armor herself against this pull that promised nothing but deeper chains. But the Undercroft's isolation bred honesty, the wind's mournful song outside urging confession. "It was my mother's," she said finally, her voice a thread in the dimness. "A lunar shard, said to guide the pathfinder, the one who sees destinies entwined. After Elendor, it shattered in my hands as if the goddess broke it to mark the lie. I spoke the name because the pack weakens. Shadows gather at the borders, drawn by the unconfessed blood. You feel it too, don't you? The curse that follows you." Severin's breath caught, his eyes darkening as recognition dawned. He had sensed it, the unnatural fogs creeping from the eastern wilds. Weavos that weren't wolf but something older, vengeful. Rival alphas exploited the fractures, but this felt deeper. A spiritual rot born of his buried sin. In her words, he glimpsed a common foe. Not just enemies without, but the ghosts within that threatened them both. Empathy stirred, unbidden, transforming the instinctive tug into something tentative, a bridge over the chasm of their worlds. He unchained her wrists with a swift motion, the metal falling away like shed skin, his touch lingering just long enough to send warmth flooding her chilled limbs. Before she could recoil, a distant rumble shook the Undercroft. Thunder, or worse, the Citadel's alarms blaring faintly through the stone. Severin tensed, rising to his full height, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword at his belt. "The borders," he growled, the melancholy yielding to the Alpha's resolve. "They come under cover of storm. Stay here, no, with me. If your pendant reveals paths, it may light ours against this darkness." Vesa stood, rubbing her wrists, the freedom a dizzying rush that warred with caution. The bond pulled stronger now, empathy weaving through the fear, her curiosity blooming into reluctant alliance. Outside, the wind howled fiercer, carrying the metallic scent of blood on the breeze, enemies breaching the gates, drawn by the trial's disruption. She clutched the pendant, its warmth surging as if alive, and followed him toward the door, the torchlight painting their shadows as one. In this refuge of stone and flame, protection forged a fragile link, his guilt meeting her defiance, two souls shielding against the night that sought to claim them both. But as they ascended into the fray, Vesa wondered, what mercy could bind a king and his accuser when the storm demanded choices sharper than steel? The moon watched from above, her light fracturing through the clouds like the pendant's shards, illuminating a path neither could yet refuse. The storm broke upon Frostspire Citadel, like the goddess's own fury, winds lashing the ancient walls with fists of ice and snow that howled through the mountain passes. Vesa followed Severin up the spiraling stone stairs from the Undercroft, her unchained wrists still tingling from his touch, a warmth that clashed with the biting gale rushing down to meet them. The pendant at her throat thrummed now, not faintly as before, but with insistent pulses that synced to her racing heart, as if awakening to the chaos above. She had rationalized the bond as mere survival's illusion, a desperate thread in the dark. But each step closer to the fray eroded her defenses, stirring an empathy she dared not name. He moved ahead, his broad back a shield against the onslaught, yet she sensed the weight he carried. Not just the sword drawn at his side, but the ghosts of Elendor that her words had exhumed, making every shadow a potential reckoning. They emerged into the courtyard, where the waxing moon pierced the roiling clouds like a fractured eye, casting silver shards across the snow-swept flagstones. Torches sputtered in iron brackets, their flames whipping wildly, painting the scene in strokes of orange and deep crimson that mirrored the blood already staining the outer gates. Warriors scrambled into formation, their breaths fogging the air in urgent clouds, armor clanking like the bones of the restless dead. The alarm's wail cut through the tempest, a piercing keen that blended with distant weavos. Not the packs, but something feral and ancient, echoing from the eastern wilds where fog clung like a shroud. Rival clans had struck under the storm's veil, exploiting the trial's disruption, their shadows slinking through the breached perimeter like wolves scenting weakness. Severin barked orders, his voice a thunderclap that rallied the nearest guards, directing them to the battlements with the precision of one who had forged his rule in such fires. But as a scout burst from the gloom, bloodied and staggering, his report froze the king's blood. The fog. It's alive, my lord. Not just raiders. Shadows twist within it, pulling at our bonds, unraveling the pack's strength. Severin's glacial eyes narrowed, the melancholy in them hardening to resolve. Yet Vesa saw the flicker of dread, the curse he had buried manifesting, drawn by the unconfessed sin she had named. He turned to her then, amid the chaos, his gaze locking with hers through the swirling flakes, a silent command laced with vulnerability. Stay close. If your pendant reveals paths, now is the hour. The words ignited something within her, a spark that raced from the silver shards at her neck, blooming into heat that spread through her veins like liquid moonlight. Vesa gasped, clutching the pendant as visions unfurled unbidden, a gift long dormant. The Pathfinder's sight, her mother's whispered legacy, now shattering free like the fractured crescent itself. The courtyard blurred, the storm's roar fading to a distant hum as threads of destiny wove before her inner eye. Silver lines pulsing through the snow, tracing the invaders' hidden flanks, revealing not just their numbers, 24 shadowed figures cloaked in fog, but the spiritual rot binding them, tendrils of vengeful essence drawn from Elendor's unmarked graves. The fog was no natural mist. It was the massacre's echo, a spectral hunger feeding on the king's guilt, empowering the rivals who wielded it like a weapon forged in forgotten blood rites. She staggered, the visions pulling at her core, a visceral ache that tasted of iron and frost on her tongue. The wind tore at her shift, exposing skin to the lash of sleet, but the pain grounded her, sharpening the revelation. This was no mere sight. It was empathy incarnate, the goddess's lens forcing her to feel the invaders' rage, their losses at Elendor, twisted into this assault, mirroring Severin's own buried torment. Tears froze on her cheeks, not from cold, but from the weight of truths too vast for one soul. The pack's fractures were self-inflicted, the curse a call for confession, and she, the rejected Omega, stood as its unwilling oracle. "Severin," she whispered, her voice cutting through the gale, instinctive and raw, the formal barrier crumbling under the bond's tide. He whirled, sword raised against an advancing shadow that slithered from the fog like ink in water, its form, half man, half specter, eyes glowing with ethereal blue. The blade met resistance, not flesh, but a yielding darkness that sapped his strength, the curse's touch draining the Alpha's vitality as if Elendor's ghosts clawed at his spirit. Vesa stepped forward, unheeding the danger, her hand outstretched, the pendant blazing now with inner light that pierced the gloom. The paths, they converge here. The fog feeds on your silence. Confess, or it consumes us all. The king's strike faltered, his breath ragged, the melancholy in his eyes yielding to dawning awe as her words aligned with the visions assaulting him too, a shared glimpse, the bond amplifying her gift until he saw it. The silver threads coiling around the citadel, vulnerable at the eastern tower where the true breach yawned, unguarded and pulsing with the heart of the curse. She was the key, this broken Omega whose defiance had halted his ritual of denial. Her Pathfinder's sight illuminated the destiny he had evaded, a revelation that redemption lay not in solitary rule, but in yielding to the truth she embodied. Guilt surged through him, hot as forge fire, warring with the ethical core that had sustained his throne. Could he confess before the pack, risking fracture for the mercy her light promised? A howl rent the night, closer now, as the spectral warrior lunged again, its claws raking Severin's arm, drawing blood that steamed on the snow like an offering. Vesa cried out, the sound visceral and binding, her empathy flaring to shield him, the pendant's light erupting in a radiant arc that severed the shadow's form, dissolving it into wisps that screamed into the wind. The effort buckled her knees, the visions receding in a wave of exhaustion, leaving her trembling in the crimson-streaked snow, the metallic scent thick in her nostrils. Severin caught her, his uninjured arm encircling her waist, the contact a blaze of shared warmth that neither resisted, the instinctive pull solidifying into alliance forged in crisis. "The Eastern Tower," he growled, pulling her toward the fray, his voice laced with newfound purpose, the realization etching deeper lines of resolve across his face. "You see what I cannot. Lead us." Warriors rallied around them, eyes widening at the pendant's glow fading to embers, whispers of the goddess's favor rippling through the ranks. But as they charged into the storm, Vesa felt the cost of her manifestation. The gift demanded not just sight, but surrender, binding her fate to his in ways that terrified her rational mind. What was destiny, if it chained the rejected to the guilty, forcing choices where compassion clashed with the throne's unyielding steel? The moon watched, her light bathing the bloodied snow in silver as the battle's roar swallowed their steps, illuminating a path toward revelation's edge. The Eastern Tower loomed like a jagged fang against the storm-lashed sky, its ice-crusted battlements slick with sleet that hammered down in relentless sheets, turning the world into a blur of white fury. Vesa's legs burned as she ran beside Severin, the snow sucking at her feet with greedy insistence, each step a defiance against the exhaustion clawing at her edges. The pendant's glow had ebbed to a faint ember against her skin, but its warmth lingered in her veins, a tether to the visions that had shattered her isolation. She had seen the paths, felt the curse's hunger as if it gnawed her own bones, the spectral rot born of Elendor, twisting rival blades into extensions of the unavenged dead. Yet now, in the heart of the fray, doubt coiled tighter than the wind. Was this gift a salvation or a snare, binding her to the king whose sins it exposed? Severin's warriors flanked them, a ragged line of steel and fur cutting through the fog that writhed like living smoke, tendrils coiling around ankles and throats, sapping strength with icy whispers. Blood scented the air, sharp and coppery, mingling with the ozone bite of thunder rolling overhead. Howls pierced the gale, feral calls from the shadows, not just wolves, but echoes of the massacre, voices of the slain woven into the invaders' war cries. The rival Alpha, Thorn Blackridge, led this assault. Vesa recognized his silhouette in the chaos, a hulking form cloaked in midnight pelts, his eyes burning amber through the mist. He was no mere warlord, but a traitor from within, once Severin's sworn brother, exiled for whispers of ambition that now bloomed into open blade. Elendor's ghosts had found a vessel in him, the fog amplifying his pack's ferocity, turning them into puppets of vengeance. They crested the tower's base, where the breach yawned, a splintered gate mangled by spectral claws, bodies of fallen guards strewn like broken dolls in the crimson snow. Severin roared a challenge, his sword cleaving the air in a silver arc that scattered the nearest shadows, their forms dissolving into shrieks that clawed at Vesa's mind. She pressed against the stone wall, heart thundering, the cold leaching color from her cheeks as she fought the urge to flee. The bond pulled at her, insistent now, not just instinct, but a shared pulse. His guilt mirroring her rejection, forging empathy amid the slaughter. But love? No. She rationalized it as alliance, a fragile shield against the night. To yield would mean forgiving the throne that had cast her adrift, chaining her freedom to his redemption. Thorn emerged from the fog then, his laugh a guttural bark that cut through the storm, his axe dripping with fresh gore. Flanked by his shadowed warriors, he circled the breach like a predator toying with prey, the curse's tendrils curling from his form like black veins, pulsing with the stolen essence of Elendor. "Severin Kael," he snarled, voice laced with mocking silk, "your decrees bury truths, but the dead dig them up. This Omega of yours, does she whisper your sins, or does she bear them now?" His gaze raked over Vesa, hungry and knowing, as if the fog had fed him glimpses of her visions. The pack elders watched from the tower's heights, their faces pale masks in the torchlight, torn between loyalty and the unraveling bonds that the curse exploited. Whispers of betrayal rippling through their ranks, old grievances unearthed like bones from frost. Severin stepped forward, blood from his earlier wound tracing rivulets down his arm, staining the snow at his feet like spilled ink. His glacial eyes held Thorn's without flinching, but Vesa saw the fracture beneath. The ethical king, melancholic guardian of a fractured realm, now forced to confront the past in flesh and fury. "Elendor was my shadow," he admitted, his voice steady yet raw, carrying over the wind's howl like a confession to the moon. "A command born of desperation, innocence lost to secure our borders. I buried it to preserve the pack, but the goddess demands more than silence." The words hung heavy, a crack in the armor of rule, and the warriors faltered, the air thickening with the weight of truth unveiled. Thorn's axe lowered fractionally, surprise flickering in his amber gaze, but the curse surged, twisting his features into something feral, the fog lashing out to ensnare Severin's legs. Vesa's breath caught, the pendant flaring anew as the Pathfinder's sight pierced the veil once more, a web of silver threads illuminating the moral crossroads. She saw it all. Thorn's betrayal rooted in Elendor's aftermath, his own kin slain in the massacre, fueling a vengeance that could shatter the pack if unchecked. Forgiveness might sever the curse, binding wounds with mercy's thread. But war would claim them all, freedom's illusion in rivers of blood. Her heart ached with the choice's burden, empathy flooding her for the rival Alpha's rage, mirroring Severin's guilt, yet compassion warred with the scars of her exile. To love the king meant embracing this judgment, sacrificing her solitude for a redemption that might crown them both, or doom her to his shadows. She moved without thought, stepping between them as Thorn lunged, the fog's claws grazing her arm in a searing line that drew blood, warm and slick against the cold. "Enough!" she cried, voice visceral and commanding, the pendant's light erupting in a radiant pulse that halted the advance, threads of destiny coiling visible now to all, paths of war diverging into unity, the curse recoiling like smoke from flame. The elders gasped from above, the pack's murmurs shifting to awe as Thorn staggered, the spectral hold fracturing under her gaze. Severin's hand found her shoulder, steadying, the touch ablaze that rationalized away her resistance, empathy blooming into something deeper, resisted yet undeniable. Thorn spat blood into the snow, his form trembling as the fog thinned, revealing the man beneath the monster, eyes haunted by loss, ambition crumbling under the weight of shared sin. "Mercy from the condemned?" he rasped, axe falling limp. "Or is this the king's leash on you both?" The question pierced Vesa like wind through bone, forcing the dilemma. Forgive and forge peace, risking the pack's fractures to heal the rot, or unleash war's fury for the freedom of vengeance, her heart's isolation preserved at the cost of all. Severin met her eyes, the melancholy yielding to a quiet plea, his voice a murmur amid the dying storm. "Choose with me, Vesa. Power or compassion? The pack, hangs on it, as do we. The moon broke through the clouds then, bathing the bloodied tower in silver, her light fracturing on the pendant's shards, like promises etched in ice. Vessa's blood dripped onto the snow, mingling with his, a symbolic union that terrified her soul. What was strength, if not the mercy to forgive the unforgivable, when love demanded it as the price of rebirth? The wind whispered secrets through the stones, howls fading to silence as the judgment poised on her lips, a precipice where freedom and fate collided in the night's unyielding gaze. The snow at the eastern tower's base churned into a crimson slurry underfoot, the metallic tang of blood thick on Vessa's tongue as she stood between the two alphas, her arm throbbing where the fog's claws had raked flesh from bone. The pendant's light faded to a sullen pulse against her chest, its warmth ebbing like a retreating tide, leaving her hollowed and exposed. The storm's fury had softened to a relentless sleet, veiling the moon's silver gaze in fractured veils, but the air hummed with the aftermath's tension. Warriors frozen in their stances, elders peering from the battlements like specters weighing souls. Thorn Blackridge knelt in the slush, his axe buried hilt deep in the earth, the curse's black tendrils uncoiling from his form like smoke from a quenched pyre. His amber eyes, once feral with vengeance, now held a fractured gleam, the man's ambition stripped bare by the revelation she had forced upon them all. Vessa's breath came in ragged bursts, the cold searing her lungs as empathy's flood receded, leaving only the raw ache of choice. She had glimpsed the paths, silver threads of destiny weaving war into unity, forgiveness into fragile peace. But feeling them was torment, each possibility a blade twisting in her gut. To forgive Thorn meant absolving the rage that mirrored her own rejection, the pack's fractures mended by mercy that demanded she yield her isolation. Yet war's path promised the freedom of vengeance, her heart's solitude preserved amid the blood that would drown them. Severin's hand lingered on her shoulder, its weight a anchor and a chain, the king's touch igniting that resisted pull once more, a bond she rationalized as the goddess's cruel jest, not the love that whispered of redemption. He was the guilty throne incarnate, his confession a crack in the ice that had frozen her world, yet in his glacial eyes she saw the melancholy man pleading for shared burden, his ethical core laid bare in the snow's indifferent witness. "Choose," Thorn rasped, rising unsteadily, his voice a gravelly echo of the howls that had faded into the wind's sigh. Blood trickled from a gash on his brow, staining the midnight fur of his cloak. But the spectral hunger in him had dimmed, the fog thinning to wisps that dissolved under the moon's strengthening light. The dead of Elendor cry for justice, not your king's half-truths. Will you leash us to his mercy, Omega, or let the blood flow free? His words struck like wind through the pines, stirring murmurs from the warriors, their armor creaking as loyalties shifted like unstable frost. Vessa felt their eyes on her, the rejected one elevated to oracle, her defiance in the circle now a fulcrum for the realm's fate. The pendant warmed faintly, as if urging her toward the threads of compassion, but doubt clawed deeper. Freedom meant severing this bond, walking alone into the wilds, unclaimed and unbroken, even if it meant the pack's ruin. Severin stepped closer, his presence a wall against the sleet, the scent of pine and iron from his armor mingling with the blood's copper bite. At 43, he embodied the mountain's unyielding spine, yet the lines of guilt etched around his mouth softened in the moonlight, revealing the man who had lost his mate to a border skirmish years before Elendor, leaving him adrift in duty's cold forge. "Not my mercy alone," he murmured, his voice low and resonant, vibrating through her like the distant rumble of thunder. "Yours, Vessa. The curse feeds on our silences, mine for the command, yours for the isolation that armored your heart. Power demands war, but compassion. It rebuilds what war shatters. With me, or without, the pack's rebirth hangs on it." His words wove into her thoughts, the instinctive tug blooming into something she could no longer deny, a rationalization crumbling under empathy's weight. She saw his torment as her own, the rejection he inflicted not malice, but the desperate shield of a ruler haunted by loss, much as her exile had been the pack's fear of truths too sharp to face. The wind picked up again, carrying uivos from the distant peaks, echoes of the slain, or perhaps the goddess's breath urging resolution. Vessa's blood dripped steadily from her wound, pooling with Severin's at her feet, the crimson mingling like an unspoken vow under the snow's relentless fall. Pain lanced through her arm, grounding the spiritual vertigo, the cold numbing her fingers as she clutched the pendant's chain. Its fractured crescent caught the moon's ray, shards glinting like eyes in the night, symbols of broken legacies that might yet reform. To choose union meant sacrifice. Her freedom for his cure, the Omega's hidden strength crowning the king's fall into grace. But the dilemma tore at her. Was love redemption's proof? A fire kindled in shared guilt, or merely another hierarchy, binding her spirit to the throne that had once condemned her? Tears welled, freezing on her lashes, the sleet stinging like accusations from the elders above, who whispered of betrayal's cost. Thorn straightened fully now, his axe retrieved but held loose, the curse's hold shattered enough for reason to flicker in his gaze. "Speak, Pathfinder," he pressed, the title a reluctant concession, his voice laced with the raw edge of one tasting defeat's bitterness. The fog retreats, but the dead wait. War frees us all, or chains you to his ghosts. Warriors edged closer, breaths fogging the air in tense clouds, the citadel's torches flaring brighter as if the flames themselves sensed the precipice. Vessa's heart pounded, a visceral drum against her ribs, the bond with Severin pulling like lunar gravity, empathy transforming fear into tentative resolve. She rationalized it still, alliance, not surrender, but the warmth in her core whispered otherwise, the goddess's revelation demanding acceptance of what destiny had entwined. In that suspended hush, as the moon climbed higher, bathing the tower in unyielding silver, Vessa stepped forward, her voice rising clear and unbroken over the wind. "No more blood for buried lies," she declared, the words tasting of iron and frost, her choice a blade severing war's path. "Elendor claims us all. Forgive or fall." The pendant blazed once more, its light weaving the silver threads visible to the gathering, illuminating a union of packs under Mercy's fragile crown. Thorn's axe lowered, shock rippling through him, while Severin's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent vow in the touch that ignited her soul's rebirth. Yet as the fog fully dissipated, revealing the stars in different watch, Vessa felt the cost settle like snow on her skin, freedom sacrificed for compassion's gamble, love's proof forged in the fire of ethical surrender. But was this healing? Or merely the illusion of chains reforged? The night held its breath, the howls silent now, as the reckoning deepened into dawn's uncertain light. Dawn's first blush bled across the eastern tower's battlements, painting the melting snow in hues of rose and gold that seeped into the crimson pools at Vessa's feet. The sleet had yielded to a fragile stillness, the wind's howl reduced to a whisper through the pines, as if the goddess herself held her breath in the wake of the choice that hung between them. Her declaration echoed in the crisp air. No more blood for buried lies. A vow etched in the frost-kissed stones, binding the fractured souls before her. The pendant at her throat cooled now, its shards no longer blazing, but humming with a quiet resonance, like the last note of a sacred chant, fading into silence. Blood from her wound and Severin's mingled on the ground, steaming faintly in the chill, a symbolic forge where guilt and defiance tempered into something unyielding yet tender. Thorn Blackridge stood transfixed, his axe limp in his grip, the midnight fur of his cloak dusted with snow that clung like reluctant ghosts. The curse's tendrils had vanished entirely, leaving him hollowed, his amber eyes reflecting the moon's waning silver as the first light pierced the clouds. Vengeance's fire dimmed in him, replaced by the raw ache of recognition, the shared sin of Elendor that had twisted his ambition into monstrosity. He had come as traitor, wielding the dead's rage like a crown, but Vessa's light had stripped the illusion, forcing him to confront the man beneath, a brother betrayed by the same decree that orphaned Pax on both sides of the border. "Forgive," he echoed, the word tasting foreign on his tongue, a rasp born of surrender. His warriors lowered their blades. The fog's dissipation, revealing faces etched with exhaustion and dawning relief, loyalties realigning under the weight of her mercy. From the battlements, the elders descended in measured steps, their fur-lined cloaks trailing like shadows retreating from dawn. Whispers wove through them. Tales of the Omega's gift, the Pathfinder who had illuminated paths unseen, her rejection transmuted into the Pack's salvation. They encircled the trio, eyes wide with spiritual awe, the runes on their staves glowing faintly as if the goddess approved this union of compassion over conquest. Severin released Vessa's shoulder, only to turn her gently toward him, his glacial blues softened by the light, the lines of melancholy easing as confession's burden lifted like mist from the peaks. At 43, he was no longer the isolated king armored in regret. Her choice had cracked the ice of his solitude, allowing empathy to flow freely, the instinctive bond blooming into acceptance he no longer resisted. "You chose us," he murmured, his voice a low timbre that vibrated through the crisp air, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. "Not power's throne, but compassion's fragile crown. In you, I find the redemption I fled, the proof that love mends what war rends." Vessa's heart stuttered, the warmth of his proximity chasing the cold from her limbs, though she armored herself against it still, rationalizing the pull as the gift's echo, not the deeper tide of rebirth. Her arm throbbed, the gash a visceral reminder of sacrifice, the blood she had spilled to sever the curse, her isolation yielded for the Pack's healing. Yet in his gaze, she glimpsed her own reflection, the rejected Omega reborn, not as servant or outcast, but as the key to destiny's lock. The pendant's chain felt lighter now, its fractured crescent catching the dawn's ray, mending not in form but in purpose, a symbol of legacies reforged through choice. Empathy flooded her anew, not as burden but as bridge, forgiving the throne's shadows for the man who stood vulnerable before her. Love was no reward, but proof endured in the quiet spaces between breaths, the ethical surrender that crowned them both. Thorn knelt then, not in defeat but alliance, offering his axe hilt first to Severin, the gesture a ritual of reconciliation under the moon's fading watch. "The borders bleed no more," he said, his voice steadying, the rival's ferocity yielding to brotherhood's tentative flame. Severin accepted it with a nod, the steel's weight a bridge across old chasms, his free hand extending to Thorn in a clasp that sealed the pact. The warriors cheered, a low rumble rising like thunder's echo, their weavos blending with the wind's sigh. Triumph not of victory, but rebirth. Vessa watched, the scene unfolding in slow introspection, the snow melting around them into rivulets that carried away the night's blood, washing the tower clean. Her gift had manifested fully, the Pathfinder's sight revealing not just paths of war, but the spiritual weave of fates entwined. Severin's guilt cured by confession, Thorn's vengeance quenched by mercy, her rejection alchemized into the realm's guiding light. As the sun crested the peaks, bathing the citadel in golden warmth that chased the last shadows, Severin drew Vessa aside, away from the gathering packs that moved to mend the breached gates. The courtyard stirred with purpose. Fires kindled anew in braziers, their flames leaping like reborn spirits, the air alive with the crackle of wood and the murmur of renewed bonds. He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the frozen tear tracks on her cheek, the touch igniting a fire that spread through her core, resisted no longer. "You walked the storm for truths unspoken," he whispered, his breath warm against the dawn's chill. "In choosing compassion, you freed me and claimed your place beside, not as Omega to Alpha, but as equal in the goddess's gaze." The words unraveled her final defenses, the bond solidifying into union's quiet certainty, love's redemption, a slow burn that promised healing without erasure. Vesa leaned into him, the pendant pressing between them like a shared heartbeat, its warmth a testament to sacrifice's grace. Pain lingered in her wound, a scar to bear as reminder, but the spiritual vertigo had steadied into peace. The dilemma resolved in ethical rebirth, freedom found not in solitude, but in compassionate entanglement. The moon yielded to the sun, her silver threads woven into daylight's gold. As the packs converged under one banner, the curse's rot dissolved in confession's light. What was strength, if not this mercy that crowned the fallen, turning rejection into destiny's embrace? The wind carried distant uivos of harmony now, the mountains echoing with the promise of mended souls, as Vesa and Severin stood entwined, the first rays warming the blood-streaked snow into spring's whisper. In the heart of Frostspire, under the goddess's benevolent watch, rebirth dawned, not as flawless union, but as the profound choice to heal amid the scars, love's proof enduring like the eternal flame. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe, because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.